Giving him more chairs. Pakistan is a kind of a distant neighbor, as somebody says that, well, you can change your friends, but you can't change your neighbors. Long years have passed since the two nations acquired their own respective national trajectories, but the destinies of the two nations have been joined together in such a way that, we like it or not, the way things go on in one are bound to have an effect on the other. So I mean, in a book that one of our professors had written, although in a different context, he called that pangs of proximity. So India and Pakistan are bound to have these pangs of proximity, coupled with that historical, cultural, and of course a very important contemporary dynamic that shapes the relations. So without saying much, I myself am looking very much keenly to what Mr. Maroof would like to say on this particular issue. So welcome Maroof here, and we look forward to your participation.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sahai, Dr. Tripathi, and I'm touched and honored that all of you found the time to be here with us today. Promise to keep it a good short. In fact, I often joke with people that you call me in my sleep and I'll rattle out the history of India-Pakistan relations, because good or bad, it's something that has become so much a part of public discourse, and I myself been giving my opinion in the limited time span that television debates allow you to do. But as I learned very early after leaving the army and joining NDTV as a television correspondent, that you have to keep things short and stupid to get your point across. But in this case, I have the liberty of more time, so I'll start going at it from the best possible cut-off date in which this relationship should be viewed in the manner. As many of you know, that India-Pakistan really came into the consciousness of the international community outside the Brits primarily after our independence. And the lines were drawn in such a way that, as I have often argued, that the ideas of India and Pakistan are so much in conflict with each other. And in both cases, as you'll see in the discourse, that Kashmir tends to figure, because Kashmir is something which justifies India's entire idea of a secular nation, in as much as also justifies the idea of Pakistan. And many Pakistanis would argue that the word AK in the word Pakistan is for Azad Kashmir. Azad Kashmir, I mean, you might interpret it as their idea that Kashmir should become independent, or the part of Kashmir that is with Pakistan. If many of you are not familiar with the map, if you look at the map of India, right on the top, very prominently is the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and Azad Kashmir is one of the provinces that is in this area. But they continue to look at it as the entire state of Kashmir, and therefore, you know, every Pakistani statement, formal or otherwise, say that, you know, we must resolve all issues, including the Kashmir issue. So Kashmir, in a way, has become from the cause of the dispute between the two, it has also become now very much a kind of symbol of the dispute between the two countries. And there are views on both sides of the border. The Indian view being, let's start solving all the problems from bottom up. The easiest to solve would be perhaps people-to-people trade and interaction and more visas. And then you go up the ladder, and somewhere on the ladder closer to the top is something like the Siachen dispute or the Siachen glacier, the whole debate about it, which I'll throw a little more light on as I get along. Or the Pakistani view is that you solve Kashmir and you solve all other problems. So, I mean, you have to look at it, and I think it's even perplexing for policymakers in Washington to try and come to terms with where do they begin. You know, and there is, despite a number of think tanks internationally being focused on India-Pakistan relations, not the kind of numbers that should actually be focusing on, I find a lot of thinking in the West in particular is is pretty muddled and warped. So to try and put things in perspective, let me sort of take you back to the whole debate when the idea of Pakistan started taking root. There is a view amongst many Pakistanis that there was such a difference in culture between the Muslims of the subcontinent and the Muslims and the non-Muslim population that there was the need for an independent Muslim nation. But that falls flat on its face when you look at the course of events since independence. Pakistan was created for the Muslims of South Asia, and therefore Pakistan is different from Israel, where people of Jewish denomination from all over the world came in. But this was the one distinctive feature of this whole debate, is that it was essentially for the Muslims of South Asia. So, you were not given an invitation if you were a Malaya Muslim or an Indonesian Muslim to come and set up home in Pakistan. So there was one difference. But then again, for the Muslims of South Asia, there are two issues that strike to me as contrary to the Pakistani thesis. One is that if it was for the Muslims of South Asia, then why are Punjabis in Pakistan more equal than others? And the Muhajir community, as you might know, is a term that is used in Pakistan for outsiders. The Muhajirs essentially are marginalized. Many of them who shifted on to Dubai and London now claim that they are not Pakistani, but they are actually originally Indian, because Pakistan is a sinking ship that people do not easily want to affiliate to. And then you have the example of Bangladesh, which was again not that Pakistan thought that they would be divided on two parts of the Indian nation. As you see, west and east of India were two blocks of Pakistan. Bangladesh, which was East Pakistan, and what is West Pakistan? In fact, I have written and argued that the creation of Bangladesh was a strategic favor to Pakistan, because then Pakistan becomes one consolidated entity, then their policymakers are able to look at Pakistan as one. Anyway, having said that, where did this whole debate start from? Some argue that this debate came out of an idea of a gentleman, an eccentric called Rahmat Ali, who hosted a conference in Cambridge in 1932-33, and then they talked about the idea of Pakistan. But apparently it went into a slumber after that. But more cogent is the argument of a former diplomat, Mr. Narendra Singh Sarila, and I had the good fortune of having gone to the same school as him, who wrote this very powerful book called The Great Game Revisited, I think that's the title, in which he argued that Pakistan actually came about with a British desire to create a buffer between Afghanistan and the Indian continent. Just to give you alignment to the map so that I keep referring to it, that's Afghanistan, that is what is Pakistan. The idea of a buffer was to create a small state here, which is a small state in this region, which is now the northwest frontier, or you call it Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But this was the region they wanted to create a little Pakistan in. The rest of it, what became, and tell you the course of history, how by accident Pakistan came to be. So anyway, if that was the region that we were talking about, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, the Brits were basically wary that when the empire would fizzle out, the Russian there would take over the subcontinent. And to prevent a Russian expansion via Afghanistan into India, they started toying with this idea. And this idea got momentum amongst the Brits and the British elite for 2-3 reasons. One is that the Indian leadership of the National Congress became largely associated with Gandhiji, who were basically talking of a quit India movement. So they were falling out of favor with the Brits. Whereas the British found Mr. Jinnah as an acceptable leader of that bloc, primarily because he was propped up by the then Aga Khan. And the Aga Khan actually became an interlocutor between the Brits and Mr. Jinnah. Mr. Jinnah was an extremely successful lawyer in Bombay at a time when people could spend their whole month on 5 to 10 rupees a month. Jinnah Sahib used to earn 90,000 rupees per case, so you can imagine how wealthy he was. But having said that, Jinnah also did not perceive, even at the time of independence, when the final, the 7 or 8 year exercise came to an end on August 1947, that India and Pakistan would have such hostile relations subsequently. Therefore, in his talks, in his writings, he always talked about two things. One is the secular nation of Pakistan, and that again came up into reckoning recently when the Hindu migration took place, that if Jinnah's idea was of a different Pakistan, then why are his clones and cronies following what is clearly a theocratic state? In fact, Jinnah wouldn't recognize the Pakistan he left behind if he was to come back on this earth. The second aspect was that Jinnah talked, and people argued, and Pakistan, please remember, ladies and gentlemen, went through a huge debate about formulating its constitution between 47 and 56, and the whole debate of the constitution was what is the idea of Pakistan, and therefore they couldn't reconcile to it, and their lack of constitutional system in place led to the politicians being a sort of fighting muddle lot, which eventually created room for the army's intervention because the politicians lost legitimacy to rule. Whereas in India, we created a constitution between 47 and 49, by and large, taking the Government of India Act of 1935 and removing the word king and putting president there and keeping prime minister, and removing the word a county or a province and putting a state out there, and like that we just modified quickly. And I mean, with not to run down the good work of our founding fathers, but essentially the original foundation of the constitution lay in the Government of India Act of 1935. But anyway, to go back to this. So what happened was that Jinnah suddenly became the favored person of the British elite. And though he was arrogant, there were two issues that led to his further taking an anti-India or anti-Indian National Congress position. One was a small incident which apparently happened when Gandhiji came back to India in Porbandar and was addressing this large gathering, and Jinnah was amongst those who hosted it. But you know, he was such a star, he got up to the audience and there was large mass of crowd out there, and he started speaking in English, and Gandhi, you know, in all good intention said that, you know, the crowd can't relate to what you're saying, so why don't you speak in a language they can? And Jinnah was essentially a Khoja Ismaili from what is an area near Gujarat, in Gujarat, which is essentially here somewhere, Kathiawad, and he was therefore familiar with Gujarati language, but he made a mess of his speech because he was such a, you know, several row wearing Western Sahab, and the crowd kind of began petering out, and you know, it was just became a mismanageable. They couldn't manage the whole event after that, and Jinnah took it as probably a Gandhi slight to embarrass him, but it wasn't, from what I understand, intended to be. But there, the rift between the two started. But then in the early 40s, when the Brits were wanting to negotiate with Jinnah, also Jinnah began to find his position as a leader of the Muslim Congress, primarily because the leaders of the Muslim League, because primarily the leaders of the Indian part of what became independent India's leadership were mostly in jail because of the Quit India movement. So Jinnah actually became a politically large figure without much opposition from the opposition, because the opposition was all in jail. So by the time people came out of the jail after the Quit India movement, which was 45-46, Jinnah and the idea of Pakistan had taken root. Now, what was to be Pakistan had still to be decided, because earlier we were talking of this the bloc which was between Afghanistan and what is Pakistan now, you know, that area. But the idea began to take such a lot of emotional and mental support by many Muslims. Two or three things happened. The people, the Muslims of India who wanted a Pakistan were largely in this part of central India, UP, Bihar and MP. But the Muslims who got a Pakistan, which is now there, as Mani Shankar Iyer has said in his book Pakistan Papers, couldn't hear the mullah's azan without 4 whiskeys inside them. Now the problem was, therefore, you ended up giving a Pakistan to one who did not want it. Because the idea of Pakistan was that the Muslims would feel secure in a Muslim majority area where they would have their own political leadership in place. Giving them a country where they didn't need that much of a country. So therefore, those who remained the elites in what is Pakistan today, but what was earlier West Pakistan, were people who were not necessarily hankering for a Pakistan. But then Mountbatten, when you see Churchill as Prime Minister of Britain was reluctant to give India independence. It was only after Churchill, at the time of Attlee, a decision was taken by the British cabinet, Primarily also because Brits had gone into an overstretch strategically. I mean, you read a book by Paul Kennedy called The Rise and Fall of Great Powers, and that really defines this whole idea of strategic overstretch. And Brits were in that situation in 47, 48. But also, at the same time, Pakistan began to gather momentum because the Indian leadership was divided between whether we should have a Pakistan or not. Nehru was trying to hold on to keeping India together. So did Gandhiji also think it was a worthwhile idea. But there were Patel and others who were divided and said that if they want to go, let them go. So somehow the process of partition started taking place. When the process of partition began, one character who is not normally referred to in our dialogues, but he is really who sowed the seed of this whole mess. His name was Sir Cyril Ratcliffe. He was a London-based barrister who was brought into India by Mountbatten to partition India, having never set foot on India, so didn't really have an idea of how there is so much of ethnic and emotional connectivity, as we have even now in the case of borders in Rajasthan, where villagers from Sindh in Pakistan come and get married to people in Barmer, Bikaner side, and the marriage procession goes either side of the border. So therefore, Cyril Ratcliffe was unfortunately given a very small time span to put together the whole partition arrangement. What should have, as historians believe, taken a year plus to put into place properly, ended up becoming an exercise which was implemented in 6 to 8 weeks. So all he did was, amongst other things, Cyril Ratcliffe also got a Delhi belly. So he didn't want to travel out of India, out of Delhi. And he took a map of India and took census reports and drew lines. Where there were Muslim majorities, he gave it to Pakistan, and where there were, there was largely non-Muslim states and principalities, gave it to India. And where there was a little bit of debate or debacle, and this is where Kashmir comes in the whole debate, then they set out 3 terms of arrangement. Term 1 was Muslim majority blocks will go to Pakistan, non-Muslim majority blocks will stay in India, largely Hindu majority blocks. Secondly, where the Muslim majority is there but has a Hindu ruler, as in Kashmir, or there is a Muslim majority, a Hindu majority bloc with a Muslim ruler, which was more or less the case in Hyderabad, and what is not the city of Hyderabad, but the entire provinces, which we may were similar to Andhra Pradesh today. The whole kingdom and Nizam fiefdom of Hyderabad. So that was the ruler had to decide. Now Pakistan has a view that they got a raw deal from India on both sides. Why? For the following reasons. One is that in the case of Kashmir, as a student once in my school asked me that if you were the High Commissioner of Pakistan in India, how would you argue your case over Kashmir? And thank God the Pakistanis are not hearing me, but let me tell you what are the 4 or 5 points. A, Kashmir at that time had 2 major metalled roads being connected to mainland, which is now in Pakistan. There's what we call Azad Kashmir or POK, we prefer. There are 2 roads, one coming from Sialkot, Jammu, and if you know the map of India, Jammu is south of Kashmir. And a bit of history about Kashmir before I get on to it. Kashmir was largely a principality that was bought by Maharaja Hari Singh, who was actually the Raja of Jammu, and then he bought it from the Brits for 70 lakhs. Okay, and that became, therefore he became the Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir and not Kashmir and Jammu. Okay, that's the first thing to understand. Second is, the northern territories of Kashmir, north of what we call these are the northern territories, Gilgit, Hunza, Baltistan and all those areas. They were really outside the control of the Maharaja. They may have been largely the state of Jammu and Kashmir, and it was a maverick major of the British Army who decided, and it's a very interesting story, but I'm not going into too much of detail, who decided to hoist the flag of Pakistan there and give the whole Gilgit Hunza territory to Pakistan on his own eccentricities. And he was leading what were then known as something called the Gilgit Scouts. So that territory went to Pakistan, but really the departure and the debate was about the valley. The valley of Kashmir, as many of you would know, is really the beautiful part of Kashmir, and it has other natural resources. It has the primary river sources going into Pakistan. the Indus Valley system, and the river sources go there through the valley. The second aspect is the valley has more than 90% of the valley's population is Muslim. And if you see from the proxy initiative of Pakistan of 89-90 onwards, when the insurgency started, there was this effort to drive out the non-Muslim Pandits from the valley. The valley have a very secular culture. Historically, the Muslims went to the Pandit's house on Shiv festivals, the Pandits came to the Muslim house on Eid Day, and they spoke the same languages, but actually the Muslims of Kashmir had become Muslims only 3 or 4 generations ago. They were largely subscribers to Shivaite monotheism, and therefore to shift from Shivaite monotheism intellectually into monotheistic Islam was not too difficult, as long as your religion and your culture and your shikarawalas and all remained the same, which was the case in Jammu and Kashmir. So Kashmir did become Muslim about 2 centuries ago, but largely Muslim, and there was an earlier Muslim population. There's a Muslim population north of Kashmir in the Ladakh region also. I'll come to that a little later. So anyway, so the fact is that here was Kashmir, which in the valley, and the valley is generally in this area, it's about 86 kilometers wide, 24 kilometers, 86 kilometers long, 24 kilometers wide, and that's where Srinagar is at the hub. On one side of the valley, west of the valley, are the Pir Panjal ranges, on the other side are the Karakoram ranges, which start and lead on to Ladakh. So the valley is pretty much sort of surrounded by hills, pretty area, many of you may have visited it. The Muslim population of the state of J&K was in the valley. Totally, J&K had a 64-36 population breakdown, 36 being non-Muslims, largely Hindu Dogras, south of the valley in the area of Jammu. And in the valley, there was the 64 plus minus percentage of Jammu and Kashmir, of which most of them were Muslims. So Pakistan's argument was, since we were founded for the Muslims of the subcontinent, and since the terms of reference of foundation of the India and Pakistan were based on the Muslim populations, which were defined by Cyril Radcliffe in the 2 boundaries, one of them being the so-called the Indo-Pak border now, and the other was in Bangladesh, what was earlier East Bengal and then became East Pakistan and now Bangladesh. So these guys, anyway, their fate was sealed. It was the issue about what you do with those who are in a land area contiguous to what was Pakistan then, east or west. Now, if they were a Muslim majority population with a Muslim ruler, the issue was anyway settled, it would again go to Pakistan. But if it was a Muslim majority population with a non-Muslim ruler, as the case of Maharaja Gulab Singh, sorry, I made a mistake. Gulab Singh was the guy who bought Kashmir from the British, but his grandson Hari Singh, of whom also I have the dubious distinction of having gone to the same school too. But Maharaja Hari Singh was quite an ineffective ruler. And in fact, in all the dialogue and literature that comes out since partition, and when Nehru and others tried to talk him into joining the Indian Union, he would often claim about stomach cramps and miss out of meetings, right? Basically what he was trying to do, he was trying to see where he'd get a good deal. Now please remember, ladies and gentlemen, 3 or 4 things happened at partition. A, Cyril Radcliffe's arbitrary line was drawn. B, on the night of 14th August, morning of 15th August, when partition's deadline was to be met by 583 principalities of the Indian Union, not one, I repeat, not one, and I'm not saying it, the Congressional Research Service in Washington says it, not one state opted for Pakistan. Those who were keen on Pakistan were fence-sitters and waiting to watch who's going where and where they'll get a good deal. Bulk of those who came into India, their fate was also sealed. But there were those with questionable intent. Starting with Kerala right down below, which was then called the state of Travancore. And the Prime Minister of Travancore had struck a deal with Jinnah for trade. So he was looking for an autonomous independent arrangement dealing more with Pakistan. You had the principalities of Bhopal, which was a large Muslim principality, which is most of Madhya Pradesh now, but then it was all called Bhopal. The Nawab of Bhopal was keen to go to Pakistan. His grandson eventually became the Foreign Secretary of Pakistan, Shahryar Khan. So the eldest daughter, the Nawab had 3 daughters, the eldest went with Shahryar Khan and he became Foreign Secretary, and Begum Bhopal went there. The middle daughter was declared insane, and the youngest daughter was Nawab Patodi's mother, who became Begum Bhopal. Now, there were other states in India which were also looking where to pitch their lot in. Jodhpur was one of them. And Jodhpur was bordering the border again of Pakistan. So Jodhpur is in Rajasthan, for those of you who are not familiar. And Jodhpur was looking for a deal till, as the records show, that Mountbatten arm-twisted the Maharaja of Jodhpur, who was current Maharaja's father, to join the Indian Union. So you were then left with a few others who were undecided, primarily J&K and Hyderabad. Now Hyderabad later led to what we called a police action, was actually a military action to take over Hyderabad in 58-59 under General Temaya, Operation Polo. And a similar action took place even with Goa in 62, if I remember the date correctly. But going back again to who opted for Pakistan, only one character after 15th August opted formally for Pakistan. And that was the Nawab of Junagadh, who loved his dogs more than his begums, and he flew with his dogs and his Diwan, who was Zulfikar Bhutto's father, into Karachi, landed up and announced, I want to join the Union of Pakistan. And this was an embarrassment for Nehru and others, because Junagadh did not fall into the territory marked out by Cyril Radcliffe. So Junagadh was a bit into India, so the demand rose that those within India who want to join Pakistan should be given Pakistan. And Nehru said, I can't have a moth-eaten India. Right? So therefore, the departure points began to build up. What happened with Kashmir? A, the population. B, Kashmir's border was contiguous to Pakistan, so it filled the border requirement of the three parts of the partition plan. A, population. B, contiguity of border. 3, and that was the big issue which decided the fate of a lot of places, the intent and desire of the ruler. Now the ruler of Jammu and Kashmir wouldn't make up his mind, so he entered into a 90-day standstill agreement with Pakistan. India refused to go in for a standstill agreement. He said, I need 90 days more to think. Now, during the standstill agreement, he was negotiating with Pakistan for a better deal. I don't know the details of the agreement, but eventually what happened was that close to the nearing of the 90 days completion period, an aircraft carrying his cousin landed in Lahore, crashed or whatever. They picked up a suitcase from there, in which was the draft of a final accession arrangement that he had sent to Pakistan. Pakistan believed that wasn't the draft, but that was his actual desire to accede to India. Now, at the same time in Jammu and Kashmir, there was a rebellion against the Maharaja's misrule. Because as I said, he was fond of wine and women. And, he really did not concentrate on his responsibilities as a ruler. So there is this area which is called Poonch, Naushera, etc. Those military officers will of course be familiar with. But that's where some of the rebellion started. Now the Maharaja had 3 of his units deployed in Syria, Damascus, and as part of a British force. He flew them in. By the time he could fly them in, things began to get bad to worse. Pakistan decided that their politicians were ineffective, they couldn't get their act together, so the military in Pakistan said that we will annex Kashmir and try and ensure that by 27th of October 1947, if you look at your calendars, that would be the day Eid was to be there. And they expected Mr. Jinnah to come into Srinagar and lead the Eid namaz. It was another matter that Jinnah could not say namaz, right? But the fact is that they were hoping to do that. Now, having arranged for that, they got a lot of tribals who were looking, who were mercenary fighters, led by Pakistan army officers, because the British army at that point in time in Delhi and what was Karachi, then the capital and not Rawalpindi, was divided about the role of the army, and they didn't want their officers to be fighting their own officers, because half the British officers became part of the Indian army and less than half, 2/3, 1/3. So, but they said we can't fight, so Jinnah was said that you find your own leadership and do what you want to. But the Brits did support Jinnah's entire effort to try and take over Kashmir, because declassified documents now show that their aim was, if Pakistan had a substantial toehold over Kashmir, then Pakistan would be at an advantage during the post-conflict negotiations. So therefore, the POK area, which is the area which is west of the valley, which is now with Pakistan, was more or less, the Brits arranged for it to accede to Pakistan. Now at that point of time, the Maharaja, then in panic of losing his entire kingdom, petitioned Nehru that I will join the Union of India. Now, VP Menon, and not VK Krishna Menon, but VP Menon was the Secretary of State for Home, met the Maharaja, got him to sign the Treaty of Accession, and then flew in troops from Gurgaon, which was then an airfield, near Delhi after the Defence Committee of the Cabinet, which preceded what was known as the Cabinet Committee on Political Affairs and is today known as the Cabinet Committee on Security, gave orders for 2 infantry battalions to move into action there. And it both led to fantastic military operations, but it also led to stalling of Pakistan's military drive to get into Kashmir from a line which is now more or less become known as the de facto border, the line of control, which was earlier the ceasefire line. There are views why troops did not go beyond. The official explanation is their mandate was just to hold the operations. The other explanation, more sympathetic, is that the snowfall stopped them from moving forward. A more military explanation is that when you prepare to hold an invasion, you need less forces. If you want to push back an invasion, you need 8-10 times the force levels in the mountains to push them back. We couldn't muster that level of forces that quickly, so we just managed to hold on to where the trenches were dug. In the October-November of 1947, what became eventually the ceasefire line as per the ceasefire agreement of 1st January 1949. And that ceasefire agreement set out 3 terms. Nehru took the matter to the UN at Mountbatten's coaxing, and at the UN the issue became an India-Pakistan issue from the Kashmir issue. The then Foreign Minister of Pakistan, Zafrullah Khan, made mincemeat of the Indian argument read by Mr. Iyer, who was then the Prime Minister of J&K. And the final UN resolution wasn't too bad actually. If you look at the UN resolution, it is sympathetic to India. The problem is our bureaucrats don't know it, and when asked they hide under the table and they don't want to refer to it, and they hide themselves with the fig leaf of the Shimla agreement, which is pathetic. But let me tell you what the UN resolution said. It said a ceasefire will be agreed upon by both sides. The UN resolution was of 13th August 1948. And it said a ceasefire will be held on both sides, which anyway had been implemented because both sides militarily knew they couldn't really get much out of each other in terms of territorial gains. Once the ceasefire is implemented, Pakistan will withdraw its forces, which was led by military officers, but who were dressed as Qawwalis, and they were led by a gentleman called Major General Akbar Khan, who took a nom de war, which is a battlefield name of General Tariq. Later in his memoirs, Raiders in Kashmir, Karachi Publishers, 1956, he describes the whole operation. And General Tariq was obviously upset by Liaquat Ali, Pakistan's then Prime Minister, for not supporting the invasion when it was required, because Pakistan's politicians deterred. And that was at Baramulla, and they say for the want of 3 armored cars, Pakistan lost Kashmir. Because if he had given those 3 armored cars, they would have rolled from Baramulla into Srinagar, and the rest of it would have been different historically. But anyway, it did happen. And the Qawwalis also indulged in plunder, rape, etc., etc. And the famous monument to Sherwani from Indian Kashmir, who stood up to these people, is proof of the local people's support for the idea of Kashmir joining India. At that time, the one explanation, which doesn't go on record, but I'm writing now a book on India, Pakistan, and I'll put it on record, that Nehru was advised by Sheikh Abdullah that don't worry about what you've lost and what is POK now. He says, my writ runs in what is the valley, and as long as the valley comes to you, you're doing fine. So therefore, politically, we didn't push them back. So the UN resolution said, ceasefire, Pakistani troops to withdraw to the erstwhile territory of Jammu and Kashmir before 15th August 1947. And when Pakistan's withdrawal takes place to India and the UN observers' satisfaction, there was no mention there for India withdrawing troops. So therefore, the UN resolution de facto gave India a full presence in J&K. Bureaucrats don't seem to realize that. And the third point was, once that is done, an exercise will be carried out to seek to determine the will of the people of Jammu and Kashmir. The word plebiscite is not used. Have a look at the UN resolution. So what commonly became as plebiscite